Well, hello, welcome to the second panel on the state and local relationship, such as it is. I'm Greg Lucas, and you've got biographies of the folks up here on stage with me, but what you won't find in the biography of Los Angeles Sheriff Lee Baca is that he's one of the principal advocates of a change in federal law that allows states to give foster kids aid up to the age of 21 instead of having to stop at 18. And California's passed a law to do that, and my 2 cents would be that that's going to be one of the most positive things that's happened to a program that in the past has been one of California's most awesome social program failures. Sitting next to me is Diane Cummins, who was not only the midwife of last year's realignment, well, actually probably more than a midwife, but that in 1991. And most amazing to me, she's probably certainly the only person in this room, and potentially the only person in California that has a copy of the 1983 report created by the George Deugmasian administration that says, you know, maybe if we kind of shifted responsibility from the state to local governments, it might be more efficient and a little bit smarter. I'm assuming it was what, typed by an IBM Selectric?
It was.
You guys remember typewriters, right? And then to my immediate left is Yolo County Supervisor Mike McGowan, who, as you know, is this year's president of the, I always call it the old name, California State Association of Counties. And that's no cakewalk, so I think we'd all want to wish him congratulations and condolences all at the same time. And on my far right, which is awful symbolism, is Frank Mecca, who's one of the smartest, hardest working people I've ever met. And not only does he know his business, but he's passionate about helping the people who his association's members serve. So just to start it off, and you can all take a crack at this, I mean, we heard Daryl and Connie's politic description of how realignment is working. And so what's the real lowdown on this transfer, what was it, $6 billion worth of programs that run the gamut from everything from child welfare services to juvenile justice, to mental health, and we heard about corrections. Who wants to start? All right, or is it just an A+ on everybody's report card? And we can move on to the next question. Mike?
Sure, I'd be happy to, since you gave me the elbow. Well, it's too early to tell. I think it'd be unfair to give it a grade yet. It's really just started, as you know, and I think in the final analysis, it's going to take several years for us to really understand how well this particular realignment concept works out. We're probably going to see it first in the law enforcement arena, that is, see the impacts of this most immediately, and the sheriff, I think, could probably talk much more knowledgeably about that. But it's clear to say that we're going to have to be doing our correctional component differently. We're now going to be housing people who otherwise would have been going to prison, and that is no small task in and of itself. The other piece of that, which is so challenging for us, of course, is really watching some of these folks that are otherwise be on parole. And that's, I think, what gets us into even a more challenging arena, but also an arena that presents itself with a number of opportunities for local jurisdictions. And that is how you keep people from reoffending, how you keep them from offending in the first place in many ways. The programmatic side, the program side. It's just way too early. We're just getting started on that. I do want to give a quick commercial, though, that we wouldn't be in this mess to begin with, and we wouldn't have these great opportunities to take advantage of if it weren't for Diane Cummins and the governor and Ana Monsantos and those folks over in finance, who have worked, quite frankly, very, very constructively with certainly the county's association in trying to create this situation. And so we are most appreciative of the governor in having those folks working on this issue with us. But it's too early for me to give it a grade. I am cautiously optimistic. Yolo County is enthusiastically embracing the challenge, but we're also struggling with it, and we'll just have to wait and see how it works out.
What a perfect transition to you, Diane.
Well, how could I give ourselves anything but an A?
A minus, just to be modest.
Oh, okay, an A minus. I agree. It's too early to tell. But remember, a big part of realignment started July 1st, and that's the Health and Human Services side. So we have a little more time with that. We also had the experience of 1991. Now, we don't have the final funding structure in place, and we don't have many of the statutory changes that I think we'd all like to see to give counties more of the flexibility that we think they need to run the program. So that's on that side. On the real law enforcement side of public safety realignment, I mean, you have to appreciate this is the biggest change that has happened in the law enforcement world in 30 years. It is very significant, and there are going to be major bumps along the road. And there are going to be what we call episodic bumps there's some kind of crisis or individualized problem in a county that the Department of Corrections goes out and helps fix. And there are going to be systemic issues within realignment that it's just too early to tell. And I will certainly echo the comments that the counties have really stepped up across the board. I think in every program area, they have stepped up to try and meet this challenge. And it is a challenge. And I think the state, counties often complain the state lags behind a little, but I think the Health and Human Services Agency and its departments, and I think the Department of Corrections have stepped up to try and deal with this in a partnership way, in a different way than we have in the past. So it's going, I don't want to say remarkably well, but I think that there have actually been fewer bumps than we thought there would be in the first few months.
Frank?
Well, I think just speaking from the Health and Human Services side and going a little bit deeper, I think the grade that we would give realignment is an incomplete, but with a significant possibility that it would score highly. And the reason I say it's incomplete is there are two large pieces of undone legislative or political actions that need to take place. The first, as Diane alluded to, the structure for the programs, both corrections and Health and Human Services, after July 1 of this year, has to be enacted in an implementation bill. The governor laid out a framework in the 8 pages that I think is a very good framework. So we're actually quite optimistic that something can be enacted that really answers a lot of what we call the plumbing, but they're really key questions. How is the money allocated? How are the local funds set up? What are the rules with respect to funding allowable transfers from one program to another? How is growth allocated? So the real sort of guts of realignment will sort of be determined in that implementing bill. And the thing about 2011 realignment that's very different than 91 realignment is that in 91 realignment, it was sort of all within Health and Human Services. And we all kind of know each other. We all sort of talk to each other. We might be in our own silos, but they're worlds that we're familiar with. And the 2011 realignment actually brought the Health and Human Services world in very close contact, in intimate contact with the corrections world. And establishing those relationships and the rapport and the trust is really difficult. And I've been actually quite encouraged at the extent to which that rapport is developing, and it's going to be a process. So that's what gives us optimism for the likelihood that we'll work something out that really works. And the second very important aspect of realignment that will determine I think its ultimate grade is the passage of constitutional protections for both the state and the counties that are embedded in the governor's initiative. And we can talk a little bit more later if folks are interested, but the constitutional protection and establishment of funding rules and responsibilities for mandates or lawsuits or actions in these programs in the future that we can't even anticipate today, I think it's really critical for counties that those rules be established in the Constitution, and that's the other really important piece of undone business. And we're sort of very, very hopeful that those protections can be enacted.
Sheriff, how's it going so far?
So far, it's going rather smoothly in Los Angeles, and I can't speak for the other 57 counties, but the nature of a policy decision as large as this one is that I do believe in the fundamental principle that local solutions are inherently stronger and better than statewide solutions. And that's because the governance system is multifaceted in local counties. There's 88 independent cities in the county of Los Angeles of 10+ million people, and ironically, of the 88 cities, you have 88% of the entire population within those cities, which leaves the county with about 1.5 million people. What does that indicate? Well, it indicates that we've diffused responsibility for public safety significantly within the county, that it isn't a super agency like the LAPD and the Sheriff's Department, although we do police equally 4 million people apiece. And then the other police agencies police the rest of the population, which is over 2 million. All told, in the world of uncertainty, there are several things that have to be done before you even encounter a comfort level with something as big as shifting prisoners in the manner that's being done today. And the comfort level is to have management practices that are well ingrained in the minds of managers that's using their tools relative to the word adaptiveness. You got to adapt. You know, this is the 21st century. We can't keep on running steam locomotive systems thinking that this is going to take us into the future. You know, we change out our airplanes, we change out our highways, we change out building design, we change out a whole lot of things. But if you don't change out the criminal justice system, which is providing an opportunity here, we're just going to keep on inventing a 70% recidivism rate, which is what the state prison level is. Now, I saw it as an opportunity. I'll give you some interesting numbers, but I don't want to take too much time with this. We have 80% of our jail population of 16,000 people was basically a pre-sentence population. So the non-non-nons that when October was the starting point of all this of last year, about 90% of the non-non-nons were all high bail detention in the county jail to begin with. So when the light turned on, the first month we ended up with about 900 of these folks that never came to the state prison system to get released in the first place. They basically got shoved from the jail in terms of their status from non-convicted to convicted. About a good 70 of them had served 2 years in the county jail before trial as it is, and they were just released upon conviction. Isn't that an interesting concept? They no longer had time to serve because they'd been in there so long before the conviction. So then the net gain for the first wave was essentially about 800 inmates who were still already there. So we didn't see that huge bump, but we did get money for them that we ordinarily would not have received. So you really had a positive cash flow at that point in time. And now that we're into this a little further in time, you know, we have about 1,800 or 1,900 in the system now as a whole. My big complaint with the whole statewide system is that we don't really understand what it means to be in prison or in county jail. You know, it's not the best place in the world to encourage better behavior. It's basically a place where people get more depressed, they give up, they have some level of stress, they have to be medicated. I spend $17 million a year on psychotropic drugs. And if any one of us were to go in some of the cells and try and survive for a couple days, we'd be on psychotropic drugs. And so therefore, the opportunity for local management is that I'm starting education-based incarceration for everybody so that they can have purposefulness in the time that they're under an incarcerated environment, and stimulate their intellects, stimulate their confidence, stimulate the bad grades they had when they were going through the local public schools. Over half of them are not very successful in the school environments that they started off in, for a lot of reasons that are sociological, that on the other end of the table here, the bias, he can explain to us how people get dysfunctional fast in a society that has at-risk neighborhoods. So the context of change is my first point of saying we are making change. And we believe that reentry begins the day they go in, not the day they come out. You got to have this stream of development for the individual inmate that allows them to say, hey, I'm ready to take responsibility for my whole life. I'm ready to go to work. And that's just a starting point. So it's moving, I think, in LA so far smoothly.
Just to make sure I understand, so part of what keeps you guys from bumping up against maximum capacity is people who are not convicted or waiting for trial now don't sit in jail.
Well, that's.
I mean, I read an LA Times story where the prosecutors were a little concerned about that.
Well, I need to say this, so far, but you see the nature of the new opportunity that we're talking about is that I do need more authority to release people before they're convicted and put them on an ankle bracelet system. So we have that going now to a degree. The theory of why some people stay in jail for high bails is because they don't have the money to bail out. But the wealthy will always bail out. And you guys say, well, who's a bigger threat? The crazy wealthy guy or the crazy poor guy? I think they're both a little bit in need of supervision. So let's try and figure this out so that we're not just using the jail as supervision. Let's put them on ankle bracelets together, or rather separate. Not to dwell on the criminal justice aspect of it, but what's been the experience you hear from other counties? I mean, how are they sort of, changing the way they?
Well, you got 58 different counties in California, and you've got about 172 different ideas about how to approach any particular issue.
How many? I'm sorry to interrupt. How many do you know are under court orders for overcrowding? The last time I looked, it was around 20. But
I was going to say something.
Is it in that range?
Yeah, I don't know the exact number, and we're one of them. Yolo County's one of them.
LA is too, right?
Correct.
Yeah. It's hard for me to say. It's not a common response in counties, which is, let me back up. One of the things that's attracted me to this whole approach, and I think I'm hearing it in the sheriff's comments and his attitude, is that we have had to do things a certain way in the state of California for so long and been so restricted. The money is siloed for programs. We only get more rules to govern us and to live by every year from the state and federal, but primarily the state legislature. And that really does beat the initiative out of any institution to try to be flexible or come up with a response to a problem that isn't already prescribed to do that. And the thing that Governor Brown did when he came in is, quite frankly, very simple, is to recognize that. He jokes about how the Modokians want an entirely different sort of set of things than the Alamedians.
Is that what they call themselves?
Well, that's what he calls them.
Oh,
right?
okay.
And that's what they must be if that's what he calls them.
Truly, yeah.
Because he would know. I mean, he knows these things.
Just ask him.
Yeah. Just ask him. And it's fascinating because to answer your question, I think some of us are still adapting to the fact that we have a greater level of flexibility. Although I'll make a pitch here that that's something, as the sheriff has indicated, we need much, much more of. Because you want to encourage and incentivize the local jurisdictions' sort of individualized response to the problem. Houston, we've got a problem. How are we going to solve it? In the movie, it was done by folks having to be very creative and innovative on the spot, and they were allowed to do so without being governed by a lot of restrictions. That is not the way it's typically worked in county land through my experience. And so part of this is a slight paradigm shift that I think is very healthy, which is let's give the problem back to the locals to figure out. Now, you're never going to give us as much money as we need. We'll talk about that. But you don't have to quite worry so much about the economics if you can really stress the notion of flexibility and really getting rid of some of the regulations that we have to deal with. And that allows the sheriff to decide if a pre-sentence person is really at risk or not at risk, and not be forced to make that decision on some other arbitrary and well-meaning standard that perhaps may not be applicable. So there's as much of a psychological shift going on here as a legalistic one or statutory one. It really is, it is an attitudinal adjustment that we're all trying to make. And so every county is reacting to that a little bit differently. Yolo County, I think, has stepped up. Of course, we used to have Pat Larry back there working, doing all this stuff, and the governor's office, damn them, stole her. But we responded to that fairly quickly because it's kind of what we've been looking for. So I will, though, take this opportunity to extend the commercial. The notion of constitutional protected revenues is fundamental to us in the county. We do not trust the legislature, and I love Connie Conway, by the way, used to be a supervisor in Tulare County, had my job as the president of our state association. I love her to death. Darrell is going to be my senator in another couple of years over in West Sacramento. Another great man, I like him a lot. But we have not had confidence in that institution historically, and especially now, quite frankly, to lead us through this challenge. And the governor's acknowledging that and allowing this shift to occur means a lot to us. And so I think counties are coming to that realization and seeking that opportunity.
Well, I keep hearing the word over and over again up here, flexibility, which is the intent, obviously. But is there enough now?
No.
Well, and here's the dilemma. There are multiple levels of flexibility. So there's funding flexibility. And the way in 1991, and Kim Belche will remember this, when we proposed 1991 realignment, the administration thought, well, we'll just put all the money in a pot and county supervisors can make the decision. And we were only talking about 2 programs. We were talking about indigent health and mental health services. Well, that hit the streets and people said, well, that's not good, because the mental health advocates felt that the health advocates would take all the money. So in discussions regarding the funding surrounding realignment, it was very interesting. The Health and Human Services people really thought that the sheriff in every county would, if left to the discretion of the supervisors, would get all the money. Interestingly enough, in our meetings with the sheriffs, they thought Health and Human Services would get all the money because they're federal, a lot of them are federal entitlement programs. So the structure that we have proposed in the budget really separates the two. There's a law enforcement account, and then there's what we call the support services account.
And a bunch of little sub-accounts.
And a few little sub-accounts.
A few
sub-accounts within there to separate. So it really does kind of violate the flexibility issue because so the county has to think about it differently. And in the budget, or in the legislation last year, we created a CCP, a community corrections plan, at the local level, because we believe that each individual county is going to do this very differently, should do it very differently, to reflect the differences in the counties. What we hear, and because we did allocate in our funding model money with the so-called AB 109 offenders, money for treatment, but that's not what's happening at the local level. So there are, yes, counties have the flexibility to decide what they want to do with the resources. Let's talk about the law enforcement side, what the plan is and how they allocate the resources. If they decide to put everybody in jail, and that's how they react to realignment, that's their decision. They didn't get enough money from the state to do that. We believe that they should be using intermediate sanctions and treatment to sort of change the recidivism, change the course of people's lives. And I think that really, in the first year, that's kind of overwhelming because you're just seeing this group of people coming toward you.
Was it more expensive too?
Is what more expensive?
The steps to prevent recidivism, like,
Should be cheaper than incarcerating someone. Jail is about $100 a day. And so you can buy a lot of treatment for the money that you use for incarceration, you otherwise would use for incarceration. So I think, but in fairness, if you see this wave of people coming, you're going to do something to deal with them immediately. So you're going to focus on probation and monitoring and jail. And I think it may take a while before some counties, certainly some counties are doing it now, but before they figure out that there are these other things that they can do, not just with the 109 money, but with the other money that's sent for realignment and their own money to make a difference that ends up saving them overall county resources because they are reducing their jail costs, they're reducing their treatment costs.
well, Frank, the collaboration you were talking about, forced or otherwise, between like Health and Human Services and Corrections, does that seems like it would, by necessity, foster more flexibility and more, smarter solutions to problems.
I think that is certainly the hope. And my members are participating locally in the planning, local corrections plans. And it sort of differs community to community, the extent to which the Health and Human Services side is sort of ingrained in that planning, and there's a bell curve like in most things. The thing that's, I think, really important to underscore, though, is that realignment means very different things depending on the program you're talking about. In foster care and child protective services, the federal government cares not whether you're a Modakian or Nelamedian. The federal government requires, if you bring a child into care, you visit that child monthly. The federal government requires a whole host of mandates. They enforce equal access to services, and they expect the state, and only the state, to monitor and enforce that. And they don't acknowledge the counties sort of as an entity that they have an oversight responsibility
Which would sort of restrict flexibility, right?
Sort of begs the question, well, how do these programs fit the realignment narrative? And I think it gets to what Diane said. There are a lot of different reasons and imperatives and advantages to realignment. In the case of some Health and Human Services programs, the stability and predictability of funding, rather than the competition in the general fund, in the state budget, creates a funding advantage, but also really a predictability advantage that allows long-term planning. That's very difficult to do if you don't know from one year to the next whether or not how your programs will be funded, whether or not the governor will veto your funding. So that's sort of one sort of set of possible advantages for realignment. There is some additional fiscal flexibility, but there are limits to how much sort of on the ground local flexibility the state can provide. That's not to say there's none. There are changes that can be made sort of on the margin to enhance local control in these programs. But I just think it's important to understand that there's some fairly big breakwaters and limits to what the state can do in some of the Health and Human Services programs that's different than the corrections programs.
But I think if you look at the overall theory of keeping offenders in the community and not sending them to the state, they are in the community. The sheriffs have various tools that they can use, whether it's intermediate sanctions, GPS bracelets, flash incarceration. You can deal with, you can begin to start dealing as a county with the family. You can keep the father at home and in jail on the weekend if that's necessary. You can provide them treatment in the community. That person may be able to keep their job, keep their family intact. And that is part of the larger picture, I think. When we talk about, even if the money is separate, counties have to start thinking about how do you use all the pieces of money to get to the outcomes that you want to get to.
I'm sorry.
Greg, if I can.
Briefly,
There was
yes.
a study done that looked at the #1 driver of foster care rates, and it was female incarceration of for low-level offenses. So, I mean, clearly those connections exist.
What, I was going to ask, Sheriff, is that your view, that almost anything is better than sending people to state prison?
No, not necessarily. I think it depends on the cases. Now, in this case, the realignment is the nonviolent, non-serious, non-sexual offender that ironically becomes part of that 70% recidivism rate. And the issue is not just incarceration. The issue is, how do you deal with the predictable criminal who's already in jail, and how are you going to reprogram somehow through educational systems this individual so they don't want to come back to jail? And therein is the challenge that the state can't seem to tackle because they don't have the wherewithal to do it. But a local community does have the wherewithal to do it. And on our system, we've integrated all the information on the new parolees coming down, and it's GPSing on our particular radio cars, data screens, and we know where they all live. We never had that opportunity before. We know the terms and conditions of their release and their criminal history. Therefore, all the police agencies are able to pinpoint and monitor what these individuals are potentially doing in the event some crime starts to occur. And then the probation department has their own program of counseling and making sure that people are being prepared. And then experimentations like I have with the Urban League. I've been dealing with parolees coming out of the state prisons into Los Angeles and teaching them, ironically, leadership classes. Now, you wouldn't think leadership classes have much therapy involved in them, but principles of leadership translate into better individual management skills. And what these prisoners are lacking is they don't have a good handle on how they manage their lives. And so if you teach them to take a higher order of a goal to say, okay, I want to be a better father, I want to be a better husband or boyfriend, whatever I am. I don't want to be on the low end of my life. I know what that's all about. It's the difference between negative therapy in prisons versus positive therapy in local jails, which then leads to positive living when they're out of jail because there's a network and we know where they are, and we have a much better method of managing at-risk people that go to jail.
So did the Department of Corrections provide you with this information on parolees? Or, I mean, did they download it for you? Did you have to create the...
Well, we created it.
Okay.
We were getting their packets. You know, each prisoner has a paper packet, which ironically should be automated, but that's part of the state's problem. They weigh themselves down with a computer system they were dreaming of and spent $40 million or whatever, and it didn't work. And so give it to us locally. We have the computer system. So we download it into our local system, and we partner up with the state parole agents. You know, remember, the state parole agents are still out there. You know, they're not done with the higher risk person. They're still dealing there. So the nature of technology, the nature of 24/7 supervision, meaning cops are on duty 24/7. You know, it's not a Monday through Friday effort with parolees. It's a 7-day-a-week auditing system, managing system, tracking system. And then, of course, I took on the absconder role instead of probation. If someone's not quite following all the rules and is getting on the edge, then my deputies go out and bring them in for that flash incarceration, and then we have a panel of judges that decide whether or not they had a revocation of parole into the county jail. But it's an interesting time, and then the deputies are the teachers. You know, it changes the culture of the jails. You know, if you just hire people, pay them big salaries to just watch people do nothing or watch them not escape, then what you end up with is a taxpayer issue here. The nature of the role of a correctional officer is at stake with this transformation. People that are running jails have to do more than watch people not commit suicide or watch people not get in fights. They have to be involved in the transformational education process, which is what jails should have been in the first place and what prisons should be now.
So there's no, I mean, there's so many moving parts to this, but
I mean, if there's one thing that needs to be done here in 2012, what would that be? Would it be resolving this, what's the longer-term funding? Or, I mean, I would think that would be pretty close to the top.
My county, quite frankly, is the largest recipient of the funds, obviously. And our goal is to protect those funds, because other counties want to say, well, let's just base it on the populations of the county. Well, I mean, the ones that have never been to jail? This is money for people that are going to jail. This isn't money for the general population. Now, the fact is that LA County is, as I said, 1/3 of the entire population of the state of California. And we feed in, through our data tracking into the state, how many prisoners we're sending from LA County up to state prisons. So that's how the money should be allocated. But I'm not convinced that the state has the will yet to say to itself, what happens if the voters don't pass this initiative? Now, the counties will collapse.
This is the constitutional protection?
Correct. The counties will collapse, I don't care which it is, if that constitutional amendment is not passed. There has to be a truthfulness to the public that when you look at the surveys, and I watched the Policy Institute do all their surveys, and I especially watched it when they were surveying a 1/2-cent sales tax that I was trying to do in LA for public safety, and the voters are going to vote for it. The voters like that. They dedicated money, and they said this is what's going to be spent on is more public safety. The issue is not one of voters don't want better government. The issue is that our politicians, some of them, have convinced the voters that you shouldn't give government any more money under any circumstance. And that, to me, is what's driving the incompetence of this state, is that our state cannot afford to have elected officials say, I care about you, but don't help me care about you. Don't give me the ability to do a better job in making sure that your quality of life needs in your neighborhood are going to be sufficiently sustained so that the marketplace doesn't fluctuate during a bad economic downturn. And that's what police do, is they basically are an invisible part of the economic strategy of a country, because I can tell you right now, when the crime is too high in certain neighborhoods, prices of property go down, services have to go up, and the taxpayers' dollars are overly concentrated unnecessarily just because of crime.
So some protection in the Constitution, you said that too, Frank, that that's kind of essential. I mean, just does the whole thing crash and burn if there isn't constitutional protection?
Well, eventually, well, the suspicion is, and our belief at the county level is that eventually it does, because we started this thing out at the beginning of the year with the governor when he said, I want to shift work to you. I will give you the money and constitutionally protect those funds to you. If we change the nature of the work, then the responsibility should change as well. And that resonates with us. We don't mind getting responsibility. Matter of fact, I think the sheriff has articulated very well how we really can do a better job if we're given the opportunity and the means to do that, to incentivize us or even just allow us to be creative and do things that make sense for our particular jurisdiction as opposed to having to follow the manual. And that resonated with us very much. We don't, like I started to say before, the folks that I know in the legislature, Roger Dickinson, Darrell, Connie, all those folks are great folk. But that institution has historically been very bad for local counties or local jurisdictions when it comes to assuring us or guaranteeing us that there'll be sufficient funds for us to do the work that they've given us to do. I want to make a plug here. I think it's important for us to really focus on the one thing we can do this year is to support the governor's initiative. It does have the constitutional guarantees that the local jurisdictions need. And yes, it has additional revenues embedded in it as well, because without those additional revenues, this whole thing won't work. I don't care where you are in the partisan spectrum. Spectrums, just start looking at the numbers. If you care about education, you need to do something to generate more revenues for our educational system. Because without the passage of that initiative, education will suffer even more than the counties or the sheriff, quite frankly. And one thing we should all agree on is investing in the future of our society with improving the education of our children. And the governor's initiative does that. It also, the thing we don't talk about, which resonates with counties, is by creating those additional funds for education, it frees up the existing general fund as the economy begins to turn around to do many of these other things and actually enhance some of the programs we're talking about, whether it's mental health, foster care, adoptions, IHSS, or whatever it happens to be. There's actually more money for us to fight over. But the constitutional guarantees, these additional revenues are critical for the success. The one thing we can do this year is to see that initiative passed.
Can I comment?
Yes, but I want to ask you a slightly different question and then give you guys a chance to ask some questions. So
okay.
go ahead and comment.
Okay. I just want to clarify that the funding is ongoing. There is 1.0625 cents of a sales tax going into the local revenue fund dedicated for realignment. So yes, I guess the legislature could pass a law and the governor could sign it that would take that money away. That is certainly not the governor's intent. I don't think it's the legislature's intent either. 1991, we had a tax increase for realignment, and that money is still there at the county level, even though the state could have at any time taken that money away. I do think people in the Capitol value these programs. They value public safety and the integration of the services at the local level, and that money is there for realignment.
Okay, so rather than the most important thing that needs to happen, what is it that you are working on now?
Well, I want to talk about two things. One is certainly
Are you evading my question?
No.
Okay.
No, I'm going to answer your question. One is the funding structure, and that certainly needs to be done this year, and I think it needs to be done fairly quickly because counties should know what they're going to get for next year. So
you would go for that, right?
Funding structure and the allocations.
Yeah.
But I also think there's another really important thing that the counties have to work on and the state has to work on, and that's changing this culture of mistrust and the governor would probably call it 30 years of decision-making in Sacramento. The state is not in charge of these programs. Counties are. So they run them on behalf of the state, and the state has an appropriate role, but I think we have to start changing the culture and being partners in running the programs. And state government's not going to change overnight. It's going to take a while, but that's one thing that as we talk to state departments and as we talk to the counties, we emphasize.
Questions from you?
Yeah, if you wait just 1 second, somebody should come over there with a microphone.
While he's coming, I want to echo what Diane just said because I got on my notes here. We need a strong partnership, and instead of state
Flexibility.
and flexibility. You saw that too? Yeah. That's pretty good. Pretty good eyesight.
We can hear you.
My question is about realignment. Now, I'm on the task force for realignment for the counties and mental health. I want somebody to explain to me how this is going to be better for clients.
Oh, thank you. And how this is going to be better for clients, especially people who have mental health services now, who are facing mental health services cuts in the county, and I understand that some departments are closing and some departments are reopening and some places are going to be shifted. It's very complicated and very confusing for a client who doesn't know what's going on. So explain to me how mental health realignment is going to be better for the clients and for the county.
I don't know, do you want to take a whack at that, Frank?
Well,
Or not? I'm not.
I mean, I guess, Randy, it remains to be seen whether it will or it won't. I would only point out that the cuts and the experiences that you're referencing that concern you so much happened in the world that was unrealigned, or at least it was realigned based on the 91 realignment proposals. So the hope of realignment I mean, I represent the social service agencies, not the mental health agency, so I want to be clear about that, but the hope is that a stable and predictable revenue source, rather than the gyrations of the state budgeting process, and additional flexibility with those funds will give counties the ability to plan, be strategic, and make longer-term investments to help us grow out of what has been, what I would agree with you, is an evisceration of the safety net for the last 5 years.
Go for it.
And I would just add to that, I mean, we can guarantee the revenue stream. We can't guarantee the revenue of the revenue stream. So it is possible in the future that sales tax could dip again. I think one of the things we're looking at is having a reserve within realignment to protect against that, so it might protect against some of those fluctuations. And the other thing is, in 2011 realignment, we are actually proposing an increase for the 1991 realignment allocation, and 1991 mental health has not seen an increase over the past 4 years. So we are putting additional resources into mental health.
Well, I'd like to respond in this way, and I agree with all that. And I think it's not a very satisfying answer to the questioner. We're seeing demand for services go up, and if you look at the polling, almost any polling for the state of California, it is a nonpartisan or bipartisan or complete partisan attitude that all Californians want more services and they don't want to pay for them. So it's true, it's not a joke. And so we all want it all, no matter where you are. And I have a rural county, and some of my biggest requirements for demands are the sort of the stereotypical rich guy that goes out to the country, the venture capitalist, and he builds a McMansion, and all of a sudden he wants urban services. It's an incongruity, but nonetheless, that individual wants to have something they believe is a right that they have. They become accustomed to that. And that is a phenomenon that is going on in California today. And so, just know that that's the reality also we get to deal with every day. And on my job, try to reconcile the request for demand or the demand for services versus the ability to pay for them.
Sheriff?
Well, my comments are this. I probably run the largest mental health institution in the state of California.
Yep.
And what I believe the benefit could be, I'm not saying it will be, I say it could be, when local governments control dollars, they create more flexibility and more discretion. And my goal is this. There are 80,000 homeless people in Los Angeles County. Minimally 20,000 have mental disorders, and they could be co-occurring disorders. Therefore, they're not just on a one-track form of mental illness. The nature of their neglect is shameful because of the absence of local control over dollars. I've had my conversations with the Director of Mental Health of the state of California. They do their best. However, they don't see the problem like we see it locally. And then they use existing institutions of mental health care and say that's all we really have in the way of our problem. And then those that are on the homeless side have to bounce in and out of the county jail to get their proper medication because they go off medication by virtue of their mental illness when they're on the street homeless. So there is a possibility that people like myself are going to lobby for money. And then there are opportunities for individuals perhaps that you might be aware of that can lobby as well for the nature of finding an equitable solution. The answer is an equitable solution, not a non-solution for homeless people, but an equitable solution in view of the dollars.
We have time for one more quick question and a quick answer. Yes, ma'am.
No, not her.
Oh, I can go to the other
No,
one.
I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
Hi, I'm Jenny Puttyfoot with the California Research Bureau. My question is with the flexibility leading to variations between counties in terms of these programs, and how you see that not over time sort of diminishing all of the different programs within counties to sort of the lowest common denominator. And I'm thinking of something like the THP Plus program for foster care, where some counties may opt to stay in and fund that particular program and others won't, and what that means for foster kids in one county versus another county, for example.
Okay, well, someone will answer your question, but before we do, thank you, Sheriff Baca, for being here. He's got to leave.
Well, I'd like to start out real quickly. That actually is one, the question reminds me of one of the things that the governor talked about a year ago that was really music to our ears in Countyland, which is he said one size does not fit all. And that's oversimplification. But quite frankly, I only speak for myself, and I've been doing it since 1902. I've been on the county board of supervisors since '93, and the one size fits all that we have to have, they all have the same standard, whether it's for indigent health or whether it's for mental health or whatever it happens to be. I would say to you, it doesn't work. There are differences in standards between California and Oregon, and California and Nevada, Arizona. There are neighbors. It would not be the end of the world for different counties to have different standards of level of service. And I'd actually like to see what will happen if we go to a model where counties have greater flexibility. We start to see some differences. We don't know because we've never really been allowed to do it that way, not in my lifetime.
I mean, you've also, the program that you've talked about, foster care and child welfare, is probably the program among health and welfare and perhaps corrections that has the most robust and enforced outcome accountability system. I'd say it probably rivals any in government-funded services, not just our arena. So the federal government requires the monitoring of how kids are doing. The federal government requires some equal access to services. The law still requires, as Greg pointed out, was referring to AB 12, every county has to implement the extension of foster care past 18. There are going to be some variations in how counties do that, but frankly, there are big variations in those things now. We hear foster kids complain all the time now. I can get something in Alameda that I can't get in Modoc, or vice versa. So, I mean, of all the programs where I would worry, I'd probably worry least about child welfare because, in part because of the commitment of everyone to that program. I mean, it was the counties that actually partnered with nonprofits that actually made that mandate happen. So it's hard to imagine that somehow they're going to have some disaffection with it. But I think it's a lesson for other programs as well. If we have a good outcome system and we can monitor those, we should be keeping our eyes on that, not the inputs.
Well, the other thing I've noticed, and I think your outcome approach is actually very valid in this regard to answer your question. And I forgot the rest of my answer, so I'll go to Diane.
Well, you know that I worked for someone who cares very much about that program and calls me constantly about it. But I think here's the theory, and I think we have yet to see whether the theory and practice work. But the theory is if the county has the money and the county has the responsibility, they are going to make the best choices within the array of services that they have, because fiscal incentives do work. We would hope that they cross lines between law enforcement and the Health and Human Services programs, but just like the state couldn't sustain a prison system, at the local level, they cannot sustain a jail system. You can't build your way into this program or out of this program. So I think they are going to look for those kinds of programs where you invest the least amount of money and make the biggest difference. And again, Kim Belshea will remember this, and I remember Governor Wilson saying to us one time, if you had a blank piece of paper, you can't tell me this is the system you would create. And I think the system that we want to move toward is very different. And if you have the resources, you have the flexibility, you have the accountability, you will make choices in your best fiscal reality, but I think they are the program reality, and they are for the best program outcomes.
And the last word.
Yeah, well, I remember what I was going to say, because it actually is the positive part, I think, that you're getting your question. You know, right now there's very little incentive for Yolo County to look at what their neighbors are doing, because we all have to do the same thing in the same way. And I actually think if we are allowed to experiment more and adapt more to solve problems, the more we're apt. Well, counties are also pretty good thieves, and so we're more apt to look at what our neighbors are doing and saying, well, what are they doing down there over in Solano County that we're not doing? How come they're doing it better? And that allows us to either do more collaboration, but also it allows us to borrow somebody else's good idea. And right now, there's not as much of that incentive as I'd like to see in the work that we do.
Mike McGowan, Diane Cummins, Frank Mecca, what a terrific panel. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Good job.